Good evening, and welcome to Crossfire Constitution. Tonight, we delve into a profoundly significant and perennially debated question. Should the U.S. President possess the authority to launch military action without the explicit consent of Congress? This issue touches upon the very bedrock of American constitutional governance, balancing national security imperatives with democratic accountability. Joining us to dissect this complex matter are two distinguished experts, Professor Alistair Finch, a renowned constitutional law scholar, and Ms. Cassandra Bellwether, a former senior congressional advisor. We will begin with opening statements, followed by a moderated discussion, and conclude with closing remarks from each of our guests. Professor Finch, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. The question before us is not merely academic. It concerns the very capacity of the United States to defend itself and its interests in an increasingly volatile and complex global landscape. I contend that the President, by virtue of Article 2 of the Constitution, is vested with the inherent authority as Commander-in-Chief to initiate military action, particularly when faced with imminent threats that demand swift, decisive, and often clandestine responses. Consider the nature of modern warfare: asymmetric threats, cyber attacks, and non-state actors operating transnationally. These challenges frequently necessitate an executive agility that the deliberative and sometimes ponderous processes of Congress cannot realistically provide in a timely fashion. Historical precedent, stretching from Jefferson's actions against the Barbary pirates to more contemporary examples, demonstrates a consistent pattern of presidents acting unilaterally to protect American lives and vital national security interests, often with subsequent, rather than prior, congressional involvement. While the War Powers Resolution of 1973 sought to reassert congressional authority, its practical application and constitutional validity have been subjects of enduring debate. In many instances, its rigid timelines and reporting requirements can prove counterproductive, potentially telegraphing intentions or hampering operational security in fast-moving crises. Therefore, a pragmatic constitutional exegesis acknowledges that in specific, narrowly defined circumstances, primarily involving self-defense or the preemption of an immediate, credible threat, the President must retain the latitude to act without prior congressional sanction to safeguard the nation.
Dr. Hayes, Professor Finch, thank you. While I acknowledge the gravity of national security concerns, I must firmly assert that the power to commit this nation to war unequivocally rests with the United States Congress, as explicitly delineated in Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution. The framers, profoundly wary of concentrated executive power, particularly in matters of war and peace, deliberately designed a system of checks and balances. They entrusted the decision to engage in hostilities to the legislative branch, the body most directly accountable to the American people. To permit unilateral presidential military action, save perhaps for repelling a sudden attack on U.S. soil, is to erode this foundational principle and risk entangling the nation in conflicts lacking broad political consensus and democratic legitimacy. The War Powers Resolution, far from being an impractical impediment, represents a crucial legislative safeguard. It attempts to restore the constitutional balance by ensuring that Congress is involved in decisions that could lead to prolonged military engagements and the profound sacrifices they entail. The argument for executive agility, while superficially appealing, often overlooks the inherent dangers of unchecked power, the potential for ill-considered interventions, the misinterpretation of intelligence, and the circumvention of public debate and deliberation, which are vital for the long-term sustainability and moral authority of our foreign policy. Adherence to the constitutional process, including robust congressional debate and authorization, is not a sign of weakness, but a testament to the strength and wisdom of our democratic framework.
Thank you both for those compelling opening statements. Professor Finch, Ms. Bellwether raises the crucial point of the framers' intent and the explicit language of Article 1, Section 8. How do you reconcile your position with what appears to be a clear textual assignment of war powers to Congress?
Indeed, Dr. Hayes. Article 1, Section 8 grants Congress the power to, quote, declare war. However, the constitutional landscape is more nuanced than a single phrase might suggest. The President, as Commander-in-Chief, has coexisting responsibilities to, quote, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution and the nation. Historically, declarations of war have been infrequent. Many military engagements, crucial for national security, have occurred without such formal declarations, under the President's authority to repel attacks or protect U.S. citizens and interests abroad. This isn't a modern invention. It's a long-standing practice reflecting the executive's unique role in foreign affairs and crisis response.
Professor, with all due respect, long-standing practice does not equate to constitutional sanction, particularly when such practice systematically erodes a power expressly granted to another branch. The framers distinguished between declaring war and conducting it. They envisioned Congress deciding whether to go to war, and the President, as Commander-in-Chief, directing those hostilities once authorized. The proliferation of undeclared wars represents a significant departure from this original understanding, not a confirmation of inherent executive power to initiate them.
Professor Finch, you mentioned imminent threats as a justification for unilateral action. Ms. Bellwether, how do you view this concept? Can Congress truly act with the requisite speed when faced with, for instance, intelligence suggesting an immediate terrorist plot or a cyber attack in progress?
The definition of an imminent threat is indeed critical, and regrettably, often malleable. A genuinely imminent threat, an attack already underway or about to occur, naturally permits defensive action under the President's inherent powers to repel sudden attacks. However, the term has been expansively interpreted to justify preemptive actions based on speculative or longer-term intelligence, blurring the lines considerably. Regarding congressional agility, while the legislative process can be deliberative, it is not inherently inert. Congress has demonstrated its capacity to act swiftly when national security is clearly and presently endangered. Furthermore, mechanisms for confidential consultations between the executive and congressional leadership exist to address urgent, sensitive matters without compromising operational security.
Ms. Bellwether, while I appreciate the ideal of swift congressional action, the realities of modern intelligence, particularly concerning non-state actors or sophisticated cyber threats, often present a window of opportunity that is measured in hours, not days or weeks. Waiting for a full congressional debate, however expedited, could mean forfeiting the chance to neutralize a threat effectively. The War Powers Resolution, with its 60-day clock, implicitly acknowledges the President might have to act first. But even its consultation requirements can be problematic in highly classified, time-sensitive scenarios. Is it not a greater dereliction of duty for a president to fail to act decisively to prevent an attack due to procedural constraints than to act and then seek congressional validation?
Let's discuss the War Powers Resolution itself. Professor Finch, you've expressed skepticism about its practicality. Ms. Bellwether, you champion it as a vital check. Is it, in its current form, an effective mechanism, an unconstitutional infringement on executive power, or perhaps an outdated tool in the 21st century?
I maintain that the War Powers Resolution, despite its imperfections and the consistent attempts by successive administrations to narrowly interpret or circumvent it, remains a vital instrument of legislative oversight. It is an assertion of Congress's constitutional prerogative. It's not an infringement, but a framework for ensuring that the executive's use of force is subject to the scrutiny and authorization of the people's representatives. If it is perceived as, quote, outdated, the solution is not to ignore it, but for Congress to engage in a robust debate to modernize it, ensuring it remains relevant to contemporary challenges while upholding its core principles.
The quote, vital instrument Ms. Bellwether describes has, in practice, often been either ignored by presidents who deem it unconstitutional or followed in a pro forma manner that doesn't genuinely constrain executive decision-making in the critical initial stages of a crisis. Its reporting requirements can, at times, force premature disclosure of sensitive operations. Moreover, the very premise that Congress can effectively legislate the conduct of foreign policy and military strategy on such a granular level is questionable. The executive is uniquely equipped for such tasks.
Another complex area is distinguishing between, quote, defensive and, quote, offensive military actions. Who should draw this line? And how does that determination impact the requirement for congressional approval?
The distinction is often incredibly challenging in practice. An action perceived as defensive by one party can easily be construed as offensive by another. For instance, is a preemptive strike against a terrorist group actively plotting an attack defensive or offensive? I would argue it is fundamentally defensive, aimed at protecting American lives. The President, privy to the full spectrum of intelligence, is best positioned to make that initial determination, though it should certainly be communicated to Congress and the public with appropriate transparency as circumstances permit.
This is precisely where the danger of unilateral interpretation lies, Professor. Allowing the executive to solely define what constitutes quote, defensive action creates a loophole ripe for exploitation. Historically, many aggressive military adventures have been framed as defensive. Congress, as a deliberative body representing diverse perspectives, is essential in scrutinizing such claims and preventing the executive from embarking on offensive wars under the guise of defense. The threshold for bypassing congressional authorization must be exceptionally high and clearly defined.
And what role does international law and our treaty obligations play in this domestic constitutional debate? Do they further constrain or perhaps empower presidential action?
International law and treaty obligations, such as those under NATO's Article 5, can indeed create scenarios where a president might be compelled to act swiftly in collective self-defense. These are commitments ratified by the Senate, carrying the force of law. However, they do not typically supersede the fundamental constitutional allocation of powers. Rather, they add another layer of complexity, where the president's actions might be justified under international commitments, but still require appropriate engagement with Congress under domestic law, even if retrospectively in urgent cases.
Treaty obligations are indeed significant, but they cannot be used as a pretext to bypass fundamental constitutional requirements for authorizing the use of force. The act of entering into a treaty is itself a shared power between the President and the Senate. It would be a perversion of that process if treaty commitments were then invoked to grant the President a unilateral war-making power that the Constitution reserves for the full Congress. International obligations should inform, but not override, our domestic constitutional processes for such grave decisions.
In closing, Dr. Hayes, the core of my argument rests upon the inescapable reality that the modern world demands an executive capable of swift, decisive action to protect this nation and its interests from rapidly evolving threats. The President's role as Commander-in-Chief, buttressed by historical precedent, and the inherent responsibilities of the office, provides the constitutional foundation for such initiative, particularly when secrecy and speed are paramount to success and the preservation of life. Ms. Bellwether has eloquently championed the vital role of Congress, and I do not dispute the importance of legislative oversight and deliberation in the broader context of our foreign policy and military commitments. However, her understandable concern regarding potential executive overreach must be balanced against the risk of paralysis in moments of acute crisis. The solution is not to unduly hamstring the executive with rigid, impractical prior constraints that may fail us when we most need agile leadership. Rather, it lies in robust after-the-fact congressional review, stringent oversight, and a clear understanding that such unilateral presidential actions must be reserved for truly exceptional circumstances directly tied to national self-preservation. Ultimately, safeguarding the United States requires both a vigilant Congress and an empowered, decisive executive. True constitutional fidelity involves recognizing the distinct yet complementary roles of each branch in ensuring our security and upholding our values. especially when time is of the essence.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. I wish to reiterate that the decision to commit American lives and resources to military conflict is among the most solemn and consequential choices our nation can make. It is a decision the framers, with profound wisdom, entrusted primarily to the legislative branch, the body most directly accountable to the citizenry. The constitutional mandate for congressional authorization of war is not a mere procedural technicality. It is a cornerstone of our democratic republic, designed to ensure collective judgment, foster public debate, and prevent the concentration of unchecked power in the hands of one individual. Professor Finch speaks of executive agility, but I caution that such agility, when untethered from congressional consent, can lead to ill-considered engagements, prolonged conflicts without clear objectives or popular backing, and an erosion of the democratic principles we claim to defend. His suggestion that after-the-fact review is sufficient fundamentally misunderstands the framers' intent. They sought congressional authorization, not merely consultation or subsequent ratification of decisions already made and actions already taken. The power to initiate war is distinct and deliberately placed. Adherence to our constitutional processes, even when challenging or seemingly inefficient in the face of perceived urgency, ultimately yields wiser, more sustainable, and more legitimate foreign policy. It ensures that the awesome decision to wage war is made with the deliberation and consent befitting a government of, by, and for the people.
Professor Alistair Finch, Ms. Cassandra Bellwether, thank you both for an exceptionally insightful and robust discussion on this critical constitutional question. You have laid bare the fundamental tensions between the demand for executive decisiveness in national security and the imperative of congressional authority and democratic accountability in matters of war and peace. The arguments presented today underscore the enduring complexity of interpreting our Constitution in an ever-changing world. We encourage our audience to continue reflecting on these vital issues and their profound implications for our republic. Thank you for joining Crossfire Constitution.